I'm Jamie.
And I'm Emma, and today we are speaking to Greg Buchanan, game writer and storyteller who has been listed in Forbes 30 Under 30. His first novel, 16 Horses, comes out on the 13th of May 2021 in the UK and the 20th of July in the US. Hi, Greg. Thank you for coming on the show.
Hello.
Before we go into this wild and crazy ride that you've had with 16 Horses, I just wanted to take it back a little bit earlier because you have written stories across a bunch of different mediums, comic books, video games, and now a novel itself coming out. And we would just love to know where writing started for you. Did you always want to be a writer?
Sure, yes. In primary school, as with many writers, if you ask many writers when they started, there was a kind of, I think, 8 or 9 years old. I quite enjoyed writing stories, often little sci-fi stories, which had character names that were suspiciously like me and my friends, which I'm sure is the truth for a lot of people. And around the time, I think I was perceived, it was one of the things I was seen as good at. So that was nice, getting some reinforcement from my teacher and people I knew. Sure. And I started being allowed to write. It was the kind of thing where the teacher would tell you to write a story about the woods or police or whatever. And she let me start doing whatever I wanted for those sessions, which was quite nice and a nice bit of kind of affirmation and let me be a bit more creative. And then I wrote a bunch of stories around then, kept going, but died down a bit as I approached secondary school. And it actually really kicked off for me again in a very strange story, which also makes a nice little anecdote, but is actually true at the same time. I was hit by a car when I was about 12 or 13.
Wow.
And I was fine. I was concussed. So I was completely knocked to the ground. I was out for a minute or two, which I didn't realize at the time because I didn't know I was concussed. From my perspective, I'd just been knocked to the ground and then got up again. Yeah. My friend didn't tell me till later that I'd been lying there for ages. Weirdest detail was my shoes was untied and thrown off me, which apparently happens as a thing when you're hit by a car. And my father brought me to the hospital when I got home because I walked. The people who hit me let me walk home, which was weird, and I didn't know they were the ones who hit me, but because I was dazed.
Off you go now.
Yeah, they ran over to me and were like, "You okay? Do you need an ambulance?" And from my perspective, I'm like a little kid, so I'm like, "No, I'm fine," because I felt fine, which I gather they just took my word on and then they left. So a sort of pseudo hit and run, not quite a full run, but
run.
I know.
Yeah. And Dad, very alarmed, took me to hospital. I was ultimately fine, just a bit bruised and off. But I had to wait in the hospital ward for ages that day, and he had some Stephen King books in his car. On writing and The Gunslinger, which is this Dark Tower series. And I was reading through these. I got super into Stephen King as a result. Maybe slightly too young to get into Stephen King, especially those books. But I got super into it. And I read on writing, and I read The Dark Tower, and then I read all the thrillers and horror books and everything. And I then started just writing rip-off Stephen King stories, which people seem to like. And then since then, that was a sort of more adolescent, I want to be a writer now with a capital W. Yeah. I became quite pretentious for a while after that. So like the closer I got to university and studying like old literature, the more I started I think that the theme here is I just trying to mimic whoever I read. I started inappropriately mimicking like 17th century people for a bit. And very recently I got into doing good stuff again, I think. So that's my journey, if that makes any sense, from wanting to be
Okay, so you knew from a young age that this was what you wanted to do, really?
Yeah, and it's been strange having that as a dream from a young age, because everyone has, a lot of writers will say that they always want to be a writer and stuff, but I remember it almost, it's been a really, I really want to do that. That's like a hope for the future, but that can also be a depressing or upsetting thing for those moments in your life where you feel like very far from that in a way that's strange. So being about like 19 or 20, being in my very pretentious phase I just mentioned, yes. Knowing like for 7 years, for my whole kind of formative period, wanting to be a writer and being so far from it then was like a very upsetting thing as well. So it's been a kind of good thing and a bad thing, holding on to that for so long.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And going on, so you then studied English literature at university?
Yes.
And was your first job in writing, was that for video games?
Yes, I was... So I did the English literature undergraduate course, and then I was, oh no, I now have to enter the workforce. What do? I still want to write these novels and blah, blah, blah. So I was writing my work, and then I decided, I'll just keep doing academia. I'll keep studying novels, and then this will help me understand novels better. It'll help me understand writing better, and I can feed that back to my work. And that was my hope. And I just kept doing it. So I eventually did a PhD in English literature as well. And in the closing stages of that, I ended up doing some consulting for some companies on narrative, because a lot of my PhD looked at how structure and identification and characterization all work. And it looked at both novels and video games, which is an unusual comparison. But I looked at issues of how control and interactivity work in lots of different types of stuff. And this was interesting to some companies I worked with. So I worked with an exam board who was interested in some of these principles and how to apply them to their kind of work, how to test and train people. And it was during this phase, the very end of the PhD, where I was working on that stuff. So I'd started like earning some money at the same time as I was finishing off, where I ended up going to a games jam event, which is an event where people try and make a video game within 24 hours just for free or for fun. And it's a nice activity. And you get a lot of people who are more, what you say, amateur status, who are just trying to or trying to get into the industry. And you also have some people who are quite advanced there. And I walked in very jittery, but with the full kind of confidence of someone trying to con their way in to seeming like they knew what they were doing. So I was like, I'm a writer without having actually written before. And it went well. Unfortunately, the team I worked with at that were a team from a company called Lionhead who used to work on the Fable series.
Oh, yeah.
They were all really lovely, but they shut down like a couple of weeks later after that event. So there was a kind of, oh no, all the people I've met at games now no longer, the company doesn't exist anymore. But it gave me a lot of confidence, and it showed me people acted like the stuff I produced was as good as I was claiming it might be, if that makes any sense. Like I did the imposter thing, but it worked, so therefore it seemed about right. And and that was my first professional writing after that, because after that I used those skills to make some of my own games. Those got picked up in publications, and then it eventually led towards paying work. I transitioned from that kind of consultancy to what I really wanted to do, which was creative writing.
Amazing. Sure. Do you think delving into your literature studies really helped you for your initial approach into the writing world? Because a lot of people obviously have different approaches, and yours has been academic. And then, as you said, it set up a lot of, or maybe opened a lot of doors, do you think? Or am I not right in saying that?
I think so. I think there's obviously the skills side of things where I can discuss certain types of text, or I know certain things from what I studied. But in the pure kind of, does the qualification help? Did that help open doors? I think it did in a kind of, for some companies it really did. For some companies it was irrelevant in the game space. I know that very early on, the fact that I'd worked on a professional basis in that consulting I mentioned, and I had the PhD. So I'd been paid by a company to do stuff related to narrative, and my PhD was helpful as an approach early on, because you have the benefit of the doubt that you're someone who's paid for this kind of ideas work at the very least. Yeah. So you can combine that, if you're on the edge, with the actual writing samples in front of you in terms of professionalism. And I know some people I've worked with have been really interested in that qualification and that sense of knowledge or skills that would give me. But equally, in many cases, it's the kind of thing where I used to, before I worked in games writing, I used to on my CV have the big education bit in quite a lot of detail. Whereas eventually, although I still feature my kind of core university qualifications there, it's nowhere near a highlight as it once was. And because it's not what people are, it's one of those things as well that once you have some projects in your CV and you've demonstrated you can do it, that's more what people are interested in, those things. Yeah. So it was really a gateway thing.
Academic studies, your degree and your PhD, presumably a lot of that, you did say your PhD did a little bit on video games, but you mentioned you worked with the Lionhead team who did Fable, which I'm aware is a kind of open story world. You also were named in Forbes 2019 30 Under 30 list for your work on No Man's Sky, which is a big exploration survival game. In terms of the narrative structure, how did you originally learn to do non-linear stories, and how different is that? Or how hard was the transition from like a traditional story to a non-linear story like they use in video games?
So I think part of what made that easier in terms of what I've been studying for the last few years. So in the PhD, I looked at novels, I looked at video games, like I said, but some of those novels were really normal standard novels, like the ones you're probably thinking of in your head, book with a beginning and an end. But some of them were quite experimental stories, not exactly choose your own adventure, but almost. So one was this book in a box by this guy called B.S. Johnson, and you'd open the box and there was all these booklets inside, and one bit says beginning, one bit says end, but the rest you can read in any sequence, and
That's
the book
cool.
resolves itself. And there's one that's even more experimental, but not quite as good, called Composition Number One by, I think, Mark Supporter, I think is the author's name. And that similarly has a kind of, that's just like pages that are separate and can be read in lots of different order sequences. And the more I studied those, the more I realized that we impose an order on storytelling ourselves. So even though your text and the authority of the author didn't really provide one, they were like, read it in any order you want. You'll make the same kinds of assumptions and structural work trying to go through those books as you would if it had been a defined order. The main difference is that you're aware of it, and that people's readings can maybe vary a bit more wildly as a result. And so entering video games and knowing that you can encounter lots of different story pieces in different ways, to me, I knew that the end result for the player wasn't going to be as different as I might have imagined if I'd not had that experience, in that I knew they were going to impose order on it. And some of the things as well is that you can have certain kind of touchstones. In a big video game term for this kind of stuff is the lore, as in the kind of background mysteries of the game's storytelling universe. And you can have various touchstones and big things in the lore that, if you mention, the elements you provide for those will connect up in the player's mind, regardless of the sequence which they encounter them. They'll be able to build the story of what happened in a certain way.
Like breadcrumbs.
Yeah, definitely. And there is some sequential elements to them anyway, like generally where people will begin, at the very least, which can have a big impact on how the rest of it goes.
Oh, okay. And then going on from that, you've also, I don't know how you've managed this, but you've also worked on graphic novels, which is a whole other style of writing and storytelling. Do you illustrate, or did you work with an illustrator when you did those?
Oh, so I work with artists and illustrators on those. The kind of biggest thing I've worked on hasn't been announced yet. So it's mostly what's available online is shorter pieces I've shared. But yeah, with those, I'll write a script for the team I work with. And the way it works is I'll write the dialogue and the descriptions and the layouts of what happens on each page. They're penciler or whichever kind of, there's lots of different types of artists that can work together as a team. But they'll draw layouts of that. I might then edit my script as a result. They'll then draw the full pages or see what it looks like. I can then edit my script further. So it's a kind of nice thing where, unlike even with a kind of television program or film, you can quite iteratively build your writing and go back to it and make it better once you see what your creative collaborators have done in a way that's maybe a bit harder elsewhere, but that's very fun and very loose.
Mm-hmm. And how did you first get into that? How did you meet the team that you created? Because I imagine the relationship that you guys have must be quite important, because there's always going to be, you need to synergize without too much pushback, but just enough.
Oh, definitely. So with some of them, I put out an open call very early on when I was working on some of the shorts for possible collaborators. And then I'd look at their art and then I'd think who best fits the style I'm trying to work with and so on. As I've gone on, I've acted slightly more on a recommendation or connection between other people. So if you work with one person, they can then recommend they work well with these other people, particularly in the relationship between people who draw the comic and people who color the comic or ink it. That's a very important relationship. And they'll often have someone that they've worked with before, which is a better than just clutching at straws from thin air and connecting possibly very disparate styles. And sometimes the relationships, because there's other writers and other people in, for example, video games who have worked in comics as well. And sometimes you'll work on certain intellectual properties in video games that are also exploited or written about in comics. And so those kind of connections can lead to opportunities opening up as well. Because if you've written for one kind of IP in one field, you benefit of the doubt. Just like I was saying earlier with having worked on consulting, I could then possibly do this kind of narrative idea work elsewhere. It helps build confidence and interest in your work.
Brilliant.
Yeah, it's brilliant. In regards to stripping it right back in terms of going to the submitting phases and getting an agent and being published, do you feel like already being a writer for video content and obviously comics really helped you in regards to getting an agent for novel writing? Is it the same agent, or how did that work for you? How did that how was that gap bridged?
So I have a slightly strange origin story with the literary side of things and getting an agent and my publishing deal. So I remember I told you that I did that game jam with the Lionhead team.
Sure.
Yeah.
And after that, I worked on my own projects, and then they ended up getting coverage and so on. Around the same time as this was happening, and people had given me that in-person validation of acting like I was a writer and treating me like I was a writer, rather than the kind of thing, I've talked to other writers about this, the kind of thing where you say, oh, I'm a writer to someone, and they go, oh yeah, and there's a kind of a bit of an eye roll, because a lot of people say they are, but then, no, I actually am. It makes it a bit different. And regardless of the rightness or wrongness of that kind of snobbery that it exists, and a lot of us have experienced it to our detriment. And so that gave me some confidence, and I decided to apply for the University of East Anglia Creative Writing MA. So I'd heard it had a really good reputation and had produced lots of good writers. And I thought, if I get some training for my novel writing, this will help me do that more or better than I was doing already. And I got in, much to my surprise, because I found my interviews were lovely, but I found myself oddly tested in the conversation in a way I didn't expect, and it made me examine my core of why I was writing and what I was even doing with my life.
What sort of questions did they ask?
Oh, so it was, I think something was said, that this is a very rough paraphrase. So if whoever's listening to this was one of my interviewers and you didn't say this, then it just makes a good story. But they said something to the effect of, oh, we really like your writing examples. We really like your sense of style and how you do it all. But we do feel there's a kind of sense of kind of emotion and core kind of presence of you on the page is missing. And it's a bit cold and sterile as a result, despite the kind of how good technically it is. Why do you think that is? Why do you think you do hold back from putting your emotions and your inner self on the page? And I was like, what? That's why I was like freaked out, because
it's
like therapy.
Yeah, and writing, the relationship between writing and the publishing industry and therapy is fascinating in that sense of how much they can resemble each other. But yeah, I can't remember fully what I said to the question because I was dazed at the time from that. But afterwards, that actually drove me to do some of my games work I did at the time. The biggest early projects I did was about the then impending Brexit vote. And it was like clocks had just been shot, and the national atmosphere, whichever side you're on, was kind of terrifying. And so I ended up doing a piece related to that. It wasn't a kind of a dogmatic kind of preachy piece. It was more using the emotional mood of the time, tell a little dark horror story about a politician and a cafe and this kind of dark, murky argument. But I did that. So I was like, I'm going to write, what do I care about right now? I care about what's going on. I'm going to do that. And that actually really helped me. So that kind of set me up in games, that conversation, indirectly. But I got in to the course, but they said I got in for a year and a few months, so I had a lot of time until the course began. And that I started my work in games whilst waiting for the UEA course to begin, weirdly. So I knew I wanted to do the novel course and try and get the opportunities from that whilst I was doing a lot of the games work. And whilst it was good I did, because it helped fund the course when I was doing the course, because I could do part-time games work. But whilst on that, there's an anthology of pieces by people who are studying on the course that is handed out to agents and publishers towards the end. And my piece I had in that was the beginning of my novel, 16 Horses. And that got the attention of a bunch of people, of agents, who then contacted me instead of the other way around.
Amazing.
And yeah, which is an unusual kind of almost freakish occurrence.
That's wild. That's the first we've had on this podcast.
Definitely.
Agents contacted them.
It was really nice, but terrifying at the same time, because you don't really know. All the advice that everyone else gives you is for totally the other direction around, so you don't really know what to do. But yeah, and so although some of them found out about my games work and some of them brought that up in our conversation, some of them didn't, it wasn't like the primary kind of starting point of it, but it did give more stuff for us to talk about. And I must admit that I did pay attention to how people discuss that element, like whether because games are viewed a bit of a certain way culturally by a lot of people, whether they were curious about it or whether they were dismissive about it was interesting to me. Not a deal breaker, but it was a topic of how are people going to respond to this and me and what my interests are.
Sure.
And so, yeah.
Moving on to the novel, like obviously 16 Horses, what were your inspirations behind writing this?
The novel started as almost a completely different thing, and it didn't originally have horses in it, which surprises a lot of people. The topic is that 16 horses of buzzards are found buried in a field, so how would it possibly start without that? Yeah. But it was, so when I was in UEA, it was in Norwich, I went to Great Yarmouth, which is just a bit to the side, I think half an hour a train, 40 minutes. And I spent some time there completely off season when it was very grey, rainy, totally empty. Oh, yeah. Huge rows of amusement arcades with absolutely no one in them, which felt bizarre in terms of like, why are they even switching the lights on if no one's using them? Surely the electricity costs alone would make this not make any sense today. But I spent a lot of time around there, and the mood and atmosphere of the place really made me want to write about a place like this. And I wrote these kind of short pieces and vignettes about people in an imaginary kind of decaying UK seaside town. that was a bit darker than some of the depictions of such towns I'd seen on television and in recent fiction, where although you're told that the place isn't doing very well, that the town has like a functioning newspaper department with multiple people working there, loads of visitors, whereas this place I was, at least the time of year, I was completely empty and void of anyone. Like some of the streets were completely empty. And that idea of disappearance became really key to what 16 Horses was about at the beginning, and what it still is really about now in many different ways. And in almost a big film I saw around the time that was a big inspirational novel as well was Peter Weir's Picnic at Hanging Rock, which just has this great moment of, for those who aren't aware of what the film is about, it's a group of schoolgirls go missing in the Australian kind of outback, or in this hanging rock, this place. And although it's about their disappearance and what it does to the community, you don't really get full answers to a lot of the questions you might have while watching the film. And it was a very kind of mysterious, eerie, almost science fiction horror thing without ever actually having any science fiction or horror in it. Right. This kind of really intense atmosphere. And I was just enchanted by that. And thinking about what I was trying to about with this fictional town, I started imagining what if various people in that town just started going missing and disappearing from their life and being forgotten about. And that element, that plot, the way I was using those characters is not present in the final book. That was almost my way into it and imagining these people. And but for that plot line that I was working on, where it was going to have almost a sense of mass disappearance, I wanted a kind of opening that had an inciting event of almost weirdness that would lead to events occurring, or at least our way into those events as in the fiction. And I wrote about a policeman walking across a farmer's field with a farmer, and they were going to come across something. And when I was working on that, I didn't actually know what they were going to come across. So I was just writing a conversation between these two men walking towards something that was going to be quite eerie. And I hoped, whilst writing it good, because I didn't know what I was going to write at the end of it. And I actually was almost tempted to use some kind of other animal. And I resolved I was going to have some kind of animal discovery, almost in that sense of, in the horror genre, the discovery of dead animals or something wrong with nature was often a kind of omen or portent of larger social collapse to come. Like lambs being born misshapen and so on. And in the end, they came across horses, and I sent in that whole piece to the class, and the reaction to that was much stronger than anything I'd sent in before by miles. And the seminar leader, who was Giles Foden, who wrote Last King of Scotland, he was a huge supporter of it, and he actually just said, as did various other people, why are you writing about this kind of plot with the disappearances? Why don't you just write about the horses? That's way more interesting. And when I'd written that initial bit, I had an explanation in mind for what that plot of the element, that bit of the novel would relate to, but that then became the novel. I jettisoned some of the other kind of weirder elements that I was going to use. And I mentioned that I did the anthology, and some of the agents asked me for the novel. Having read that beginning chapter, around the time I decided to jettison the rest of the novel was around the time people started expressing interest. So I thought, oh, wait another month or two, please, and then just hurriedly chucked most of the novel at once and started again, realizing that this other thing was much better. And lots of other things then contributed to the rest of it. But I almost wrote a totally different novel that one bit I think was very good of, and then I took that bit out and then wrote a whole new novel just based as a spin-off of that chapter from the original version.
That's great.
And then you ended up, the novel itself ended up being picked up in the US and the UK just off the first 16,000 words. Is that right?
Yes, and that was a complete, since that's been said, it feels almost coincidental, like a marketing thing, that it was 16. But I was told by some of the agents to send in 15,000 words, and I just overshot. So it was a sort of unintentional. Yes, it did. And that was a big surprise to me, because I'd chosen my agent, and I was going on a work trip to Canada. So there was an idea that we were going to meet for lunch when I got back from this trip to discuss the future and what we were going to do with it all. And then I found at that lunch that, oh, by the way, a publisher has actually already expressed interest. And that was very unexpectedly exciting and weird compared to what I thought it would all be, which was great.
Did you feel a bit nervous going from game writing into novel writing, or was something that you felt that was seamless for you? Like you felt because of obviously going to do the course and your style of writing, it was easy?
So I think it was interesting. What game writing gave me that I didn't have before, and really valuable, is partly a sense of writing experientially. So in game writing, you're writing for someone to do something in that space. They're going to interact, move things around. So you have to think a lot about experience, which is true of novels. Novels are an experience as well, just you don't think of them in that way when working on them. And also dialogue is very important in video games, in that games are such a kind of multifaceted and huge field compared to what a lot of people I think imagine who don't play a lot of games.
Some of them might as well be interactive novels. Some of them look like films.
Yeah.
There's a huge variety. So sometimes when you write for them, you have to write dialogue for actual actors, which sort of hones how you're going to write, because there's the kind of thing I think Harrison Ford said about George Lucas's script, that you can write this stuff. He didn't say stuff, but you can write this stuff, George, but you can't say it, or something to that effect.
Yeah.
And so you have to really hone dialogue and experience. And remember I mentioned before that I'd gone really pretentious in my late teens. This was the sort of great antidote to pretension and what I was trying to do, and that it added the exact elements my work was lacking. And so I think that made it a lot easier. And sometimes even when I'm drafting, I'll write a very rough draft of a dialogue-heavy chapter just as pure script, and then we'll use that when I'm doing my polished draft, as a way of doing it in a more easy fashion. You feel the rhythm of the conversation more if you don't think about the other elements for some of those bits, or at least for me. So that gave me a lot of skills and confidence in some areas. In other areas, it was it was weird, because I really liked game writing, but I never. Remember I mentioned when I was young, I always wanted to be a novelist. It's not like I always wanted to be a games writer, despite enjoying games and really liking to play them. So when I was game writing, you have your fears and your doubts, and you're wondering if you're good enough and so on. But because I almost happened into it, I didn't quite have some of the psychological baggage I think I had when I started. I was finally achieving my dream with the novels. And there was this whole thing where I think I was talking to my fiance about it, and she said it's almost like I put the novel on a pedestal at an early stage, in terms of this must be completely perfect 100%, whereas with my games I do my best and I work really hard, but almost any imperfections in what I'm producing are accepted as a natural part of any creative process, and possibly as a strength. And that sometimes when you're forced to do something, or something doesn't quite work, that can actually open up new opportunities, and you see it for what it is. Whereas I couldn't. So I could apply some of the more tangible skills to my novel writing, but in other ways. Even though I was a perfectly mentally healthy game writer, to some extent, I was a gibbering wreck at various stages of being a novelist.
I think that's quite a common thing, where people put a lot of pressure on themselves with their novel and just with their writing generally, and they come out and they think this has to be perfect. Like so every single sentence must be perfect, otherwise I have to get rid of it or delete it. And I just wondering. So you did always want to be a novelist back when you were writing your sci-fi with the characters that were named very similar to your friends. How many books have you written before 16 Horses?
So there was the beginnings of one very pretentious novel, which was recently discovered in a box of my possessions and then destroyed very quickly, along with some poetry. And but there was another novel that I wrote when I was about 21, 22, that had a lot of very interesting ideas, and there was a lot of interesting style there. At the time, I couldn't. So some people really strongly liked it amongst my kind of friendship group, and some people couldn't stand it. And it was not exactly experimental, but it wasn't very easy reading. And I felt very fondly and almost protective of that work long after I decided I'm not going to go forward with this. But I read it a few months ago again, and I really understand almost both sides now, and I see a lot of stuff to like, especially stylistically, what I was trying to do. But I also see completely why it wasn't working in a way I couldn't have understood years ago, which I feel like was almost a tangible sign. Talking about loss of confidence, I think it was almost a tangible sign of growth in seeing it, and I saw that I was better than I was doing then, which was nice.
That's good.
Yeah, there's a strong argument that people say you have to write your first book, which is how you learn to write, and then subsequent books will always be stronger. So I think it's a concurrent theme with writers, I think. I know that's how I felt after I wrote my first book. Looking back at it now, and I'm like, wow, how did I ever think that was going to work?
Don't we all? I think people also get really caught up in terms of how to get the words on a page. And I was interested to know, Greg, how that works for you and how you just get the words on the page. What's your style?
So this is, I feel, so I'm working on another book at the moment, and I totally thought that when I finished my first book and I went through the editing process, that I steam out as a brand new writer, where I knew now what to do, and I had all that kind of sense of confidence. And unfortunately, lockdown hit at the exact time of that transition. So I don't know whether that was due to the weirdness of early lockdown or it being difficult to work on a second piece. But it's all going very well now. But I've been thinking a lot lately about how I write and the approach I'm taking right now. And I iteratively move between planning and free writing, like whatever I want for a chapter. And I find I definitely have creative ideas because of that flexibility. And because of suddenly writing something on a page that excites me, because it excites me, or it sounds, what's going on with that, and provokes curiosity in me, that I try and put on the page. But also, for a lot of, especially for the kind of at least last 2/3 of a novel, you need to very heavily plan various elements of that for it to work. Otherwise, you're just going to go off into the distance. And I think that's a big lesson I learned with the 16 Horses was it was actually a lesson I learned in game writing. This was a more tangible thing that I applied from game writing to partway through 16 Horses, because it really helped me with a little bit of block I was experiencing at various points, and helps me now, is to think about the constituent elements of a kind of a scene, so to speak, in a novel will often involve dialogue. I think I said before, I will sometimes just free write the dialogue alone by itself if it's a very dialogue heavy chapter. But also certain elements like description of the environment and the atmosphere, physical motions people might engage in. Those things sometimes I pre-plan, or I jot very short vignettes and short paragraphs about in isolation to the chapter itself, and have that with me when I'm writing, not as a prescriptive guide, so I can completely ignore that if I want to, but it's almost like putting my paints on a palette, so I guess, and I can use them if I want to. I've never really had problems with or any kind of hesitation about any other elements of writing and the glue between those things. It just stops me from staring at a blank page and being a bit terrified. And I'm doing a lot of that now. I'll also sometimes watch films, listen to songs, read books if I know that they had a strong feeling. Ideally, not the same kind of plot realm as what I'm writing about, because then that's a problem. But if they have a similar kind of vibe to what I want something to have, if I watch something that's got that atmosphere and that creatively excites me, I find it much easier to write the chapter I'm working on. The other day, my new book is in no way sci-fi, but I watched the beginning of 2001: A Space Odyssey and listened to the music and that kind of big black screen at the beginning, and then the apes coming out and that whole kind of scene. And that made it so much easier to produce what I was working on right after that. And likewise, sometimes even to produce those kind of initial notes, some stuff like that will help me get there. And the more kind of, it's almost like accumulating these kind of paints or layers of sediment and different materials together in a way that they eventually become more than the sum of their parts, and they eventually start feeling like they have some kind of existence independent to you just making something up. Okay. If I go to write and it's like, I need to write about funeral and someone feeling sad at the funeral, versus I need to write about funeral where a bunch of photographs are being taken inappropriately of certain elements of the funeral, like that immediately, even if that's not the big plot thrust of that chapter, that immediately casts such a kind of heavy weight.
It's a different angle, right?
Yeah,
and it in a completely different way.
Yeah, and gives you almost, if you know what you're doing as a writer and you suddenly have that kind of almost hook on your own scene, you can do the rest yourself. You don't need to pre-plan beyond that sometimes. So yeah, it's assembling those materials in advance, but also being willing to, if I'm writing and it's going well, just keep writing. Who cares if I haven't planned the rest? So yeah,
that's a great piece of advice.
That's really
I think that's
good
really
advice.
helpful.
Yeah, I think free writing seems very much like what improv is for an actor, right? It's just if you take away the constraints of having rules and regulations, and you're free for a little bit to see what happens. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And speaking of advice, Greg, I wanted to ask in three parts here, because you have done very impressively. You have done 3 different forms of storytelling, all with their own toolkits and challenges, I'm sure. If you were speaking to your younger self or other people looking to get into these kinds of writing, how would you, for video games, comics, and now a novel, what piece of advice for those 3 different things would you give to people looking to get into those industries?
So as a kind of blanket, this is an initial blanket piece of advice.
Well, you can do one for each, is what I meant. I think I phrased that really weirdly.
Oh, sure. I just meant like initially just doing something in each form. So more than anything, like so many people say they want to be a game writer. So many people say they want to make a comic. And you ask them, have they ever done anything? And they'll be like, no. And they're waiting for some kind of opportunity to be offered to them where they'll be allowed to do this, where the tools exist and are democratized now to do these things yourself at some level. No one can stop you doing a script yourself. No one can stop you. There's loads of tools online for games that you could just do something. As soon as you've done something, you are that. And that's going to cut so many people off from ever doing it in a really surprising way. So there's that initially. So for games, I'd say make something short. Don't bother trying to make your magnum opus. Don't bother trying to make some kind of like hours long piece. Use something like, so if you want to make a text-based game, it's a great way of starting because they're easy and they don't require, at least they've got a lower barrier of entry to other forms. They don't require a lot of outside involvement. Doing a piece using something like Twine, which is an online tool, you can make something about, and this is really what I wish I'd done, something about a particular event that's got some kind of dramatic scope to it. So 2 people talking in a cafe, or even something like a heist, or two people breaking up, or something that's going to be a contained event in a contained place that isn't going to last too long, but that has some kind of element of activity to it that you can play around with the interactivity and choices of a game. And so, yeah, just making something. And if you're going to make something like that, would be my advice for games. For comics, to some extent, it's a similar piece of advice. Do a short, do something that's 5 to 10 pages. With this, the biggest barrier to comics versus these other fields is money, to be honest, because if you can't illustrate the comic yourself to a great degree, you've got that barrier of being able to make it. So if you know anyone who's in any way good at art, you can try and work with them. Or to be honest, sometimes it's saving up a bit and being able to collaborate with someone, or coming up with a way of planning something with someone where they'll get as much profits, or if they want a portfolio piece or whatever. But that is a huge barrier, which I'm not quite sure how to see my way around if you're a pure writer and you're not an illustrator getting started in the field. But certainly, sort of trying to get hold of comic writer scripts is a really good thing as well for that purpose. And there's a few online websites and classes you can join. And that's what I did, where you can work with others who make comics. You can learn about how that's all done. You can actually read real samples of people's work and even critique each other's. So working on a short piece, but with others and seeing what they're all doing is a really good idea for comics, and filling in those gaps and getting a sense of how that's all done, because it's a very collaborative field in that regard. And with publishing or at least writing a novel, it's difficult because as I mentioned, I weirdly fell into this in a way that wasn't premeditated.
Very few people have had the experience you've had, I think, going into publishing.
Which is in some ways terrifying, because you always wonder, am I going to be story held up as a reason why that doesn't happen? Or am I going to be oh my God, that's a great reason for hype, that was amazing that happened. And you never know, although hopefully in this case. I think what changed for me, even throughout the course, and even working on the full novel, is thinking about, and people used to say this to me even when I was younger, and it's one of those things you can tell someone, but you have to almost understand it yourself. You have to relearn that lesson yourself, just like your parents telling you stuff, you have to sometimes learn it yourself. Is writing for the reader and thinking about the reader and what they are going to find important in what you're writing. You have to write for yourself as well to some extent. You have to write about things you're legitimately interested in, that you care about. And there's a sort of Venn there between that and what the reader will care about. But even more specifically and this is really ironic that it took me so long to learn this lesson, considering my PhD was about stuff like sequence and structure, is not overloading the reader with information in the novel that is extraneous to the dramatic situation. That is, it's not important. Like it's interesting to know that about that character, and maybe you could have a kind of online section of stuff you could learn about that character that's not there. But you even read in some published novels just so much information and flash. I find that a symptom of this, so this isn't always bad, and I do flashbacks a bit in my novel as well, but a symptom of this I find in my writing and in others is way too many flashbacks early on, or way too many movements back and forth in time, particularly the beginning of a novel. And on the UEA course, I saw that a lot as well. And I feel like if you're listening to this and you're someone who's trying to get published, or you're early on in your writing, just think about how much you move the dramatic through plot line forward. You can have those flashbacks and those explanations in the past if they serve the onward movement of the drama. And a really good thing I found for this, you remember I mentioned I iteratively plan, so sometimes I do planning, sometimes I do free writing. One thing I do throughout the novel is I go through, read what I've done so far, and I try and translate each chapter into a sort of sentence or two of what happens in the plot. Or what the function of this chapter is. So even if it's not a plot thing, what does it do? And then once you've written that list, just maybe take a few weeks off, read that list again, and does that list make sense in terms of the way you've moved that? And sometimes it really doesn't. Or you read a chapter and you struggle to say what that has to do with the dramatic,
what the point of this chapter is.
Yeah, and sometimes you can fix that by thinking, I can add this point, and you can use that raw material for a rewrite, and you've got all that kind of texture of flavour you've generated in your sort of writing stew, but you've now actually got some meat in there, and it's going to do something. And one thing I'm really doing is there's kind of GCSE study guide websites where you can see the kind of summaries of what happens in each chapter of a book. It's really interesting. For books that you read in your genre, reading some of those if you find a good one and seeing it's a way that an English literature course never looks at a story, or the way in the establishment you never talk about a story like this. But like, how many clues were in that chapter of that classic crime novel? It's a really interesting question. If you see that, you can then say, how many clues did I have? And you can really diagnose a lot of pacing problems by thinking about stuff like that, and it's not that hard to fix. That can really be to increase momentum. So yeah, I think it's just thinking what you want to do for the reader, and things I just said are ways of diagnosing or trying to attack that problem. But I think once you understand that, you don't really go back to writing the way you did before, and that's been a huge difference in my writing career, I think.
That's great advice.
That's great. Such great advice. Thank you so much, Greg. And we're going to move on to our last question now. Last, but by no means least. And the question is, drumroll, if you were stranded on a desert island and could only bring one book, what would it be and why?
This is always very difficult. I'm the kind of person when I'm asked what my favorite food is, I was collapse and indecision, like chili from The Good Place, like not knowing what to do. But I think the thing that immediately first comes to mind, which I guess is the best answer to this kind of question, is a book called Pale Fire by Vladimir Nabokov.
Okay.
It's so good. So I looked at it a bit for my PhD as one of my books that I looked at, but I've enjoyed it before and enjoyed it since. It's not one of his kind of better known text, stuff like Lita and stuff is far better known, but it's so weird in a really fun way, and if I could ever write anything like this, I'd be glad, and various other people have tried to. The novel is about a poet, John Shade, who's died, and part of the novel is just a poem, so 100 pages or so of this novel is just a poem, and you also get a preface to the poem, and you get a big commentary on the poem, and that's it. The commentary is longer than the poem itself. And you can tell from the back cover, it's really fun, the whole thing. It's presented as if you've got this dead guy's poem and you bought this in the shop. But the commentary and the preface even reveals this in the back cover, is that the guy who's edited this book and put commentary together may have possibly killed him, the poet, or at least something bad has happened between these two. And it mentions that the widow of the poet is engaged in a legal dispute to try and get the rights back, and maybe he's not being allowed to publish this edition. And the commentary is barely about the poem; it's mostly about the guy writing the commentary. And so it's got this kind of funny, playful, parodic kind of quality to it, where, especially if you study literature, it makes fun of study of literature almost in some ways. But it's, even though it's really playful and got all that stuff, it's in many ways very dark. And it's very emotionally moving as well. And that ability to be playful, experimental, and emotionally moving and dark is a kind of unusual. It's hard to do all those things at the same time.
Definitely.
And I try and have a sense of playfulness and darkness in my own writing, but I just love that kind of formal experimentation. And one, as a kind of highlight of a particular reason I like this novel is, so you read, how do you read this? Do you read the poem first in the whole thing, and then do you read the commentary, or do you read the poem and then you see there's a note to line 22, and then do you read that note and then you go back to the poem? What way do you do this? And you will find out
experience.
Yeah, and you find out the central twist of this novel in a totally different sequence depending upon whether you do that. And so it's you either find out pretty much at the beginning if you follow all the notes, or you find out at the very end. And so it's I love that, and it never tells you that. And I think in the preface he tells you how to. Nabokov's winking at you about this is a thing, and he says the ideal way to read this novel is to buy 2 copies, cut them all up, and then put the pages next to each other. And it's like a kind of finger up at the audience to like what you're supposed to do. And some stuff since has been inspired a bit by it. I think you've heard of House of Leaves by Mark Danielewski. That's got a similar kind of element in that. It's got a kind of book, and then there's a book about the book, and it's a bit more horror of that. But so there's a kind of subgenre of things that are inspired by this kind of weird experiment that I don't know what I'd ever do for it, but I just love to do something like that. And it's such fun.
I've got to get my hands on that.
Great. That sounds really good.
So
and especially if you were on a desert island, it's the kind of sort of job that you want to do, to piece together this novel from different angles. You can read it from every different angle while you're stranded on the desert. That's great. Oh, thank you so much for your time, Greg.
Thanks,
it's
Greg.
been absolutely wonderful.
Great.
Having you on as well.
That's very exciting. Thank you very much. No, it's been lovely talking. Thank you.